They led her into the admissions room with the same polite economy people use for bad news. A sheet folded just so, a chair that had seen better days, the quiet that sits heavy between creased forms and fluorescent light. Maya sat with her hands in her lap, the palms still cool from the wheelchair's armrests. The wheels had left a track on the linoleum like a path to nowhere. Around her, the world whispered in the language of denial. Paper stamps, clipped phrases, the clean, final clack of a rubber stamp that read, "Denied." "We can't help with that here," the first specialist said, voice measured, eyes on his tablet. "At this stage, it's palliative care, stabilization. There's no further surgical indication." Another doctor folded his hands and offered a pamphlet about home adaptation, about adaptive devices, as if suggesting a hobby catalog might soothe the way the future had closed. A nurse peered over the edge of a conversation and murmured, "You'll need a long-term plan. Do you have family who can care for you?" Maya heard the words and cataloged them like wounds. No, she did not. Her mother had stopped coming around after the ambulance left. Her father lived a continent away. A brother had posted politely vague notes on social media, thinking of you, and then stopped answering texts. Friends at her small bookstore had given an awkward, half-hearted visit, and then life resumed for them. Coffee orders, new displays, the rumble of the city beyond the shop's windows. They meant well, she told herself, but their lives were made of errands and brightness, not of nights on bathroom floors and insurance forms. "Everything looks very complicated," said an administrative voice. The woman at the desk slid a thick denial letter toward Maya. The insurer cited pre-existing conditions, ambiguous prognosis language, the cost-benefit ratios the company used to decide whose bodies were worth the money. Maya's mouth tasted of copper. She picked the paper up as if it were a living thing and felt the edges bite into her fingers. Outside the hospital, winter had decided to stay a little longer than it should. Ice rimed the backs of the mailboxes. The city moved in a way that made her feel like a ghost passing through a familiar film. The bus that used to stop outside her bookstore now sailed by 2 blocks away. Strangers' coats smelled of warm coffee and lives that were still whole. Maya thought of the day the accident had made a clean, irrevocable line through her life, how she had been on her bike, how traffic had misread her, how the world had decided without consulting her to shift. Before that morning, she had been small and deliberate. She loved the quiet hum of books, the exact order of things on her shelves, the way a neighbor's laugh could sound like a bell. The bookstore had been her sanctuary and work, her income and her joy. It fitted her the way a favorite cardigan fits the shoulders. She'd loved ritual. Early mornings sweeping up yesterday's pages, the ritual of tea steeping for precisely 3 minutes, the habit of leaving small handwritten notes inside returned books for regulars who liked surprises. She had not been gregarious, but she was known for listening, for sending rare first editions home with college students who needed the confidence to love something complicated. She had been independent. She had paid her rent for 8 years. She had been careful. Then a delivery truck took a corner too wide, and in the bright slash of a second, care collapsed into consequence. The doctors had called it a spinal cord injury at the cervical level. Prognosis guarded. She had woken to a body that did not respond to her will. Fingers that would not curl, legs that would not lift. The echo of that first helpless hour sat in her chest like a stone. They had tried the usual pathways. Specialists who had once been willing to talk now shuffled their shoulders and couched their answers in soft absolutes. Neuroplasticity only goes so far, one said, the sentence falling like a curt dismissal across her hopes. At the cervical level, there are limits. The words meant nothing and everything. Maya learned quickly how to translate medical phrases into the cold arithmetic of life without mobility. Days appended themselves like invoices. Hospital bills, therapy consults, letters with a firmness of font that made everything feel final. She visited facilities that offered partial help, wheelchair ramps, house modifications, things to make her life safer, but not to change the fact that a large part of her identity had been clipped. She floated through support groups where people clasped hands and told her stories in measured, hopeful cadences that sometimes comforted and sometimes carved open the places she was trying to mend. Rejections came not always as cruelty, but as inexorable corporate logic. Specialists politely declined her case because the expected functional gain didn't match the cost of intervention. A private rehab program she had hoped to access required a letter of medical necessity she could not procure. Grants asked for matching funds she did not have. Friends meant to do more but didn't know how. Her phone muted itself with unanswered pleas. The world offered practical alternatives: wheelchair-accessible apartments, therapist directories, a list of legal aids. It did not offer the thing she wanted most: a plausible path back. She learned to read the small signs of sympathy. A volunteer in the physiotherapy corridor would smile and ask about her favorite color. A speech pathologist would offer a card with a poem. Those gestures kept her company in the long hours when she could not keep company with herself. But sympathy did not change the scale of the problem. Envelopes stacked up. The bookstore shelves gathered dust. Her landlord suggested subletting. Someone else needed the rent money. She learned to read the small signs of sympathy. A volunteer in the physiotherapy corridor would smile and ask about her favorite color. A speech pathologist would offer a card with a poem. Those gestures kept her company in the long hours when she could not keep company with herself. But sympathy did not change the scale of the problem. Envelopes stacked up. The bookstore shelves gathered dust. Her landlord suggested subletting. Someone else needed the rent money. She signed forms to put the bookstore into temporary management, but every handshake felt like a relinquishment more than an arrangement. Then, 3 weeks after the insurance denial, a thin newsletter made of hospital press releases and case summaries circulated among the big-name neurologists in the city. One item was a brief, low-visibility headline about a difficult spinal case, an account of a complex referral that had been declined by several centers because the cost-benefit figures were low and risks were high. It mentioned a young woman, no name, whose chart had been copied from one specialist to another and left with a trail of boxed refusals. It was the kind of thing that would be tossed into a folder or passed on as small talk. It made its way, against the usual currents, to the desk of Dr. Daniel Hayes. Daniel read the short paragraph twice. He had a habit of doing that when those two things he had kept separate, his head and his chest, felt like they were being tugged at the same time. Professionally, he was a man who specialized in limits, the difficult cases others set aside, the anatomical disappointments that required long spans of patience and sometimes polite failure. He was known for an implacable competence that most of the hospital admired and a restlessness that made other doctors uneasy. He would read a file like a map and then spend nights imagining routes no one else had charted. He closed the newsletter and pinched the bridge of his nose. On his wall, awards sat in frames: Clinician of the Year, a grant for research, an engraved plate that hinted at monetary gifts and institutional favor. He had influence. He had resources. He had also learned in an early marriage that had burned out quietly and privately that influence was not always an answer to the hard places people carried inside them. The memory of that marriage, of a woman who left not because of any one sharp thing, but because the small omissions had added up, made him careful with attachment, careful with language, careful not to conflate professional rescue with personal hunger. He called his assistant and asked for the patient's chart. Maya's file arrived at his office like a foreign object. She became, on paper, a series of scans and notes in coded language, MRIs, Asia Impairment Scale entries, the exact cervical level, and the cascade of neural loss. But there were also the italicized notations, the personality notes from previous clinicians, the social work comments about limited family support, the notation that funding had been denied. Those lines made something in Daniel shift from clinical curiosity to a different kind of insistence. He placed the scans on his light board and stared. He did not make a decision in the way a dramatist makes one. He made a plan. He convened a multidisciplinary review, not as a spectacle, but as a pragmatic measure. A neurosurgeon he trusted for technique, a rehab specialist who had a reputation for unglamorous realism, an occupational therapist who believed in small wins, and a social worker who could navigate the thorny paths of insurance appeals and third-party funding. He asked questions no one had asked before in this particular constellation. Where, within the gray, was a scene for improvement? What could be salvaged? What surgical options, even if they offered incremental change, might lay the groundwork for months of focused neurorehabilitation? What would be ethical to attempt under supervision and with full informed consent? When he arranged to meet Maya, it was in a room so neutral it might have been designed to encourage truth-telling. Pale walls, a window that opened on a courtyard, 2 chairs, and the steady click of a clock. He entered with a folder, with the careful gait of someone who had learned to keep his expressions calibrated. He sat across from her and let the silence take its own shape before speaking. "I read your notes," he said. His voice was measured. He did not offer bluster or miracle. Many teams looked and stepped away. "I want to tell you what I see and what I think we can try, and then you decide. No persuasion, no promises. I want you to have all information. Do you want to hear it?" Maya nodded. The response required courage. She wondered briefly if hope was a dangerous currency to accept. She had been guarding herself against disappointment like an old woman might guard a winter window. Daniel unfolded his plan with the kind of clarity that made the details feel possible. A staged approach that combined an initial surgical strategy, targeted nerve transfer and decompression to create potential for reconnecting proximal muscles, with an intensive, long-term rehabilitation protocol focused on neuroplastic retraining, functional electrical stimulation, and occupational therapy that emphasized task-specific repetition. He described realistically, the surgery might produce a fistable hand. It might not. The goal was to create potentiality, not magic. He spoke of timelines in months, not weeks, of steady work with small, documented goals. He explained the risks: infection, partial failure, the possibility of no functional gain. He also outlined logistics, approvals, ethical oversight, funding applications, and the need for a patient advocate who could attend meetings and help navigate insurance appeals. When he mentioned funding, he did not wave a check. He said the hospital had discretionary funds for cases with moderate evidence and high need. He had contacts in a philanthropic foundation that sometimes supported prolonged rehab for patients who could commit to the timeline. He would not use his name to purchase compliance. He would offer pathways and let Maya choose. She asked what would happen if the surgery did nothing. He looked at her without flinching and said, "Then we continue with what we can. Management, adaptation, making sure you're stable and pain-free. But we will have tried, and you will know you tried." Maya listened. The words were not a promise, but for the first time in months, they were a map someone else was willing to hold with her. She asked about the ethics board, about oversight, about conflict of interest. Daniel answered each question with a specific detail. He said there would be a formal institutional review, that the procedure would go through internal and external peer review if necessary, and that all consent would be documented in writing. He did not look at her like a project. He looked like a clinician asked to account for his decisions. There was, in that exchange, an almost imperceptible binding, a contract of agency. Maya could refuse. She could sign away at any point. The clinician's role, he said plainly, would be to offer the best possible combination of skill and coordination, not to demand gratitude. She asked for a day to think. He gave her the day and pressed a card into her hand with his office number and the direct line to the social worker he had already assigned to her case. "Call if you have questions," he said. "Call if you change your mind." That night, in the curtained shadows of the ward, Maya tried to sleep but could only think in lists. The name of the surgeon, the dates he suggested, the promise that work would be measured in months. She thought of the bookstore when it smelled of lemon oil and dust, of the precise way she folded paper bookmarks, of a customer who had come in every Tuesday for the same dog-eared novel. She thought of a face she had loved from a distance once, someone who had told her, in a soft voice over tea, that someday everything would look different. Nothing had behaved the way that old kind voice promised. Everything had behaved as if it were a machine calculating losses. She called back before dawn. "I want to try," she said, the phone pressed to her ear like an anchor. "If you believe it's ethical, if it's not a risk for exploitation." Daniel's pause was a human thing, not calculation. "We will do it by the book," he said. "You will have the consent forms, the time to ask questions. If you feel pressured at any stage, you tell me and we stop." Consent meetings were exhaustive in the way they needed to be. The nurse practitioner walked Maya through each paragraph with the attention of someone reading a poem aloud, each clause carved and contextualized. They explained the likely course of nerve regeneration, the grafting options, the approximate rate of axonal growth that, in optimistic cases, might translate into measurable movement months later. They explained that the brain's networks would need to relearn patterns, that occupational therapy would involve rote repetition of seemingly mundane tasks, picking up beads, turning a key, holding a mug. She thought of a face she had loved from a distance once, someone who had told her, in a soft voice over tea, that someday everything would look different. Nothing had behaved the way that old kind voice promised. Everything had behaved as if it were a machine calculating losses. She called back before dawn. "I want to try," she said, the phone pressed to her ear like an anchor. "If you believe it's ethical, if it's not a risk for exploitation." Daniel's pause was a human thing, not calculation. "We will do it by the book," he said. "You will have the consent forms, the time to ask questions. If you feel pressured at any stage, you tell me and we stop." Consent meetings were exhaustive in the way they needed to be. The nurse practitioner walked Maya through each paragraph with the attention of someone reading a poem aloud, each clause carved and contextualized. They explained the likely course of nerve regeneration, the grafting options, the approximate rate of axonal growth that, in optimistic cases, might translate into measurable movement months later. They explained that the brain's networks would need to relearn patterns, that occupational therapy would involve rote repetition of seemingly mundane tasks, picking up beads, turning a key, holding a mug. They told her about functional electrical stimulation, about the discomfort and the discipline, about how progress would look non-linear and often excruciatingly slow. A social worker sat across from her and helped sketch the financial scaffolding, a combination of the hospital's funds, a pending philanthropic grant that Daniel had initiated, and a hardship appeal to the insurer that might not fully cover the cost. It would be a precarious patchwork. There were no false assurances. Savings would be swallowed. The bookstore might close. Friends might pull away. The social worker looked at her with a steady kind of optimism, the kind that does not depend on guaranteed outcomes. Maya signed. The act of staking her name to the pages felt larger than any signature she had previously penned for petty invoices or bookshop returns. This one sounded a different knell, a decision with consequences. She was not signing because she believed in miracles. She was signing because the alternative, a life made of polite refusals and the slow extinguishing of identity, was worse. Daniel placed the signed form into a neat file and wrote a note to the review board asking for expedited deliberation. He used language clinicians use to make things move. Documented indications, justifications, risk segregation, a proposed schedule for postoperative recovery, and conservative, achievable goals for 3 monthly evaluations. He called in the surgeon he trusted and asked for a preoperative meeting. He arranged for the rehab team to meet Maya in the week after surgery to create a program tailored to her goals, to hold a mug, to feed herself, to transfer from chair to bed. He arranged, quietly, for a physiotherapist to pilot an adjunct program of electrical muscle stimulation that had shown modest benefits in early studies when combined with intensive repetition. At every step he emphasized consent, oversight, documentation. He booked a slot on the ethics committee's calendar and dropped by the philanthropy office to explain the human stakes. He did not deploy his contacts in the way the tabloids like to imagine, writing a check and making a problem disappear. He used them to open doors where paperwork had created walls. But bureaucracy has its own momentum. The ethics board met and requested supplementary imaging. The insurer asked for additional functional tests. A month passed where progress felt like a series of slow, bureaucratic heartbeats. A faxed MRI, a phone call, a ghastly form requesting more justification. Maya sat in an intake room and watched the world ring the bell of her life and walk away. During that month, she noticed small things that spoke to the possibility of endurance. A physical therapist, young and deliberate, taught her how to imagine moving. Think of it as learning an old language again, the therapist said, fingers poised near her wrist. In those sessions, she practiced recruiting muscles that felt like strangers. The simplest action, curling a finger, was a negotiation with a body that had learned immobility as its default. Sometimes a twitch answered, a thermal flicker in an obtuse place. Those flickers were the embers of possibility. They were also, often, cruel, flares of hope that required more fuel than she possessed. Friends visited with macarons and awkward optimism. Her landlord called once to ask about rent. The bookstore manager sent photos, shelves half empty, an open sign that felt like a compulsion rather than a certainty. Each of those reminders was another ledger entry. She felt small under them. Finally, the day of surgery arrived like something both huge and entirely clinical. Daniel stood near the operating room with a small team and a quiet, exacting face that had become familiar in the hours when he had hovered around her case. He explained the procedure once more in the pre-op room. He asked Maya to repeat her understanding of risk, to say aloud the things they had written on the consent form. She did. She spoke each sentence like she had practiced in the sleepless hours and as if meaning each word could anchor the world against catastrophe. "You understand," he said when she had finished, "that the chance of meaningful hand function is uncertain, but that the plan is designed to maximize the odds while minimizing measurable risk. You can stop at any point. You are the one to decide." She squeezed his hand, the first time she had permitted someone to touch her in a way that might be read as trust rather than medical necessity, and said yes. The touch was brief, professional. It felt like an agreement, not a surrender. The surgery was long enough to make the body slow down. In the sterile hush, the team worked with the kind of practiced choreography that made complex things look almost ordinary. The surgeons disentangled nerves that had retracted and made delicate microscopic connections. They placed grafts where they would theoretically allow axonal crosstalk. They decompressed impingements that might have been stealing potential. Hours later, to the tick of monitors, when the anesthesia softened into waking, Maya returned to a world that smelled of antiseptic and warm blankets. The first hours post-operative were a narrow band of observation. Pain was present and managed. She drifted between sleep and clarity, her mind a carousel of fragments. Daniel visited briefly, his presence professional and contained, and he told her what she most needed, that the operation had gone as planned, that there were no immediate surgical complications, that the grafts had been placed and the team had followed the agreed protocols. He did not promise results. He promised care and the steady, structured follow-up that would be required to make anything from the surgery. The initial post-operative days were a blur of monitoring, physiotherapy consults, and visits by members of the ethics panel who wanted to see the documentation they had approved in practice. Her social worker arrived with a notebook and a sympathetic way of asking how to plan for discharge. Daniel checked in, not with triumphant optimism, but with a pragmatic schedule. Scans at 3 weeks, reassessment at 6 weeks, the initiation of intensive neuro rehab at week 6 if healing progressed without complication. The healing did not progress in any dramatic, tidy arc. Wounds closed, stitches dissolved, the grafts lay in their new beds. At the end of the 2nd week, Maya felt the first small thing she could not easily name: a faint electricity under the skin in her left hand. A physiotherapist came and placed electrodes and asked her to attempt movements she had not made in months. There was a twitch, a small thumb flexion like a house sparrow's wing. Maya cried because the sensation was both a splinter of joy and a reminder of how long the road would be. They began the rehabilitation regimen with a circumscribed, almost militant discipline. It contained, each day, sets of exercises that would have once seemed trivial: gripping clothespins, rolling small balls, transferring weight from a forearm to a wrist. Each repetition was measured and logged. The therapists used soft language to speak of goals: 3 grips in 10 minutes, the ability to hold a mug for 5 seconds. There were tears at the smallest victories and lonelier ones at the setbacks. The hospital admitted her into a supervised program that Daniel had helped orchestrate. Funding was provisional, anchored to measurable gains. He did not hide that reality. "We will measure and we will report," he said at the team meeting. "If you show engagement and measurable increments, we have philanthropic and institutional appetite to continue support. If you cannot tolerate the regimen, we pivot." He spoke as a man who preferred clarity over sentiment in the face of human fragility. The weeks folded into months in a rhythm of clinic visits, therapy sessions, and small ritualized frustrations. At times, Maya resented the watchful eyes and the forms that wanted to parse her will into percentages. At times, she felt, in the unguarded corners of the night, that gratitude was a greedy thing. She suspected people might confuse the depth of her thanks with obligation. Daniel kept his distance in the ways professionals must: present, coordinated, responsible. He visited on rounds, asked careful questions about pain levels and sleep, and ordered precise imaging when doubts crept into the team's plan. He became, to the group, less an ethereal hero and more a coordinator whose presence made authorization boxes tick in the right places. The social landscape outside remained treacherous. The insurer continued to push back on long-term funding, requesting successive reassessments and more proof of measurable function. A member of Maya's family, her mother, began to appear with more frequency, which held its own strains. Half steps toward reconciliation shadowed by old resentments. Little domestic battles flared over medication management, over the bookstore's future. Maya learned again the peculiar anger that accompanies dependency. It is a grief that bristles at how the world redistributes power. Then, in the 3rd month, an unexpected complication tightened the room like a winter draft. A low-grade infection appeared near the surgical site. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to delay vigorous physical work. Antimicrobials were prescribed. The rehab schedule had to be paused. For weeks, they asked her to limit activity and to rest. The delay ate at momentum. Daniel convened a meeting in a conference room, the kind with a long table and a projector that made everything feel more official than it needed to be. He explained the infection with the bluntness of someone who preferred facts to fear. It was localized, it was responding to antibiotics, but until it resolved, they could not proceed with the intended intensity of therapy. He also used the meeting to address the funding cliff that now threatened to swallow months of progress. The hospital's discretionary fund would not cover an indefinite stay. The philanthropic grant required visible momentum. He suggested a petition to the insurer tied to an interim goal. Demonstrated electrical activity in a set of muscles and a partial range of motion in key joints. Maya listened, stomach hollow. The research and philanthropic avenues were bridges built of fragile timbers. The idea that the progress of a person's life might hinge on the rhythms of organizational budgets struck her as correct in a world she was slowly learning to recognize as organized around money. She wrote a letter with the social worker that described in plain terms her goals and her daily discipline. The social worker attached records and logs from the therapists that recorded the twitch and the small thumb flexion. Daniel drafted a formal clinical note tying the infection's resolution to the prognosis and asking for extension of coverage. He did not style the letter with patronizing warmth. He wrote it like a clinician who believed evidence could sometimes persuade where pleas could not. There was also a private conversation that night after the clinical meeting had wrapped and the lights had been dimmed, when Daniel stopped by her room with a thermos of tea. He did not touch her. He sat in a chair placed at the end of the bed, 2 meters away, and said simply, "I want you to know I don't see you as a patient number. I see you as someone who's making a hard choice and fighting for it." Maya regarded him with guarded curiosity. He had not saved her. He had argued, arranged, and advocated. She had consented. That was where the line lived. She thought about gratitude and how quickly it can complicate any relationship with its obligations, and she answered, "I know you're not a miracle worker. I just need someone who won't make the door closing seem final." He nodded. "We'll make sure it isn't final," he said, and the sentence had no fanfare in it. It was an administrative pledge and a human vow, braided together. They both knew the risk that hovered over every shared admission. What gratitude might become if misread, what boundaries might fray under the pressure of long shared nights. They both kept their language precise, clinical, documented, ethical. Daniel completed a note in the chart explicitly stating that he would maintain transparent documentation and that any decisions about the patient's care would proceed through the usual committee processes. He asked another senior physician to serve as the attending surgeon on the day of a proposed subsequent operation and recorded that transfer formally. He insisted, without proclaiming it, that accountability be a built-in structure. Still, the infection delayed everything. And when the infection finally began to recede, the insurance company sent a terse letter asking for more proof of functional engagement before extending support. It was the kind of bureaucratic demand that could extinguish fragile momentum. The philanthropic officer promised to expedite a review, but her promises ran on calendars that often disagreed with the urgency of someone's life. Maya felt the ceiling of the hospital room press closer that day the insurer asked for more evidence. She lay there and counted the marks on the wall, and she felt something settle in her. The knowledge that to keep fighting, she would have to keep turning herself into a case study, a set of data points that justified compassion. That evening, when the lights that marked visiting hours came on and then went out, Daniel came by with a legal pad and a warmth in his voice that was all professionalism. He had prepared an appeal, documented therapy logs, the early signs of motor recruitment, a charted decline of infection markers. He wrote the letter, and, when he had finished, he did something that in any other context might have been unremarkable. He asked Maya if she wanted to read it. He insisted she sign as acknowledgement if she agreed. She read every line. She did not sign lightly. The appeal went out. There were breathless days after when nothing seemed to answer. Then, like a small miracle made of persistent paperwork, the insurer granted a provisional extension, 3 months of continued coverage tied to measurable gains. It was not a cure. It was not even an embrace. It was a lifeline. They resumed the regimen. The exercises were more brutal for the months lost. The therapist asked for more sessions, and Maya agreed. She worked in the quiet hours when most of the hospital slept. At times, she felt as if she were scraping the bottom of herself for stamina. At times, the exercises were small and beautiful. The feel of a hot mug in hands that could now hold it for a breath longer. The balanced effort of pulling a zipper. The circular motion of rubbing lotion into skin without assistance. Those were the increments of a life reclaimed, not in spectacle, but in function. And yet the story, this part of it, remained unclosed. They had won a fragile extension. They had pressured an infection into retreat. They had mounted an organized, ethical campaign for the possibility of improvement. The grafts lay in place. The nerve pathways were a garden of potential. The problem was that potential required soil and time, and most terrifyingly, the willingness to wait. Outside, accounts needed settling. Inside, muscles needed retraining. Maya warded off the old panic about permanence. She woke sometimes with a muscle memory of walking, the phantom sensation of a foot finding pavement, and then had to remind herself that the phantom was not reality. She told herself small truths. She had consented. She was engaged. She had a team who did not see her as expendable. Those truths were anchors. In the months that followed, she kept a brittle hope like a secret. Daniel remained a presence, managerial, unsentimental, occasionally tender in ways that never crossed lines. He asked questions, he arranged. He asked, too, the difficult human ones, about her fears, about her capacity to imagine life differently, to make arrangements if the bookstore could not reopen. She answered with the kind of honesty that had learned the economy of authenticity. Sometimes she wanted to rage, sometimes she wanted to sleep. Sometimes she wanted the small comfort of someone who remembered which teas she liked. They moved forward in increments measured by assessments and therapist logs and the slow accrual of regained function. The file on her bed swelled with notes and with small photographs. A therapist's camera capturing the moment she picked up a spoon unassisted for 3 seconds. A documentation photograph meant for the insurance appeal, but turned, privately, into a talisman. Yet the world outside remained precarious. The bookstore's manager sent a final message that morning. The rent had been paid for 3 months from emergency savings, but after that there would need to be decisions. Maya folded the message and placed it on the bedside table. She realized that her life would soon be a negotiation among healing, economics, and love. And then, at the edge of a cold April afternoon, as the city thawed into the possibility of spring, someone from the Philanthropic Foundation called and requested a site visit. They wanted to meet the patient, to see the evidence for themselves before releasing the next tranche of funds. The meeting would shape months to come. It would require that Maya perform, in the sense of demonstrating measurable engagement, the very thing that had kept her alive. Her willingness to continue. Maya knew the stakes. She sat in the physiotherapy room where daylight came through a high window and let the beam lay across her forearm like a pale stripe. The therapists arranged the usual sequence of exercises, and she began, as she always did, with the breath and the counting. She set her jaw against the pain, against the boredom, against the fear, and she moved. At the end of the session, skin warm and palms tingling, she signed the attendance sheet. Daniel watched the activity from the doorway, hands folded. He continued to do the thing he had started doing, push, coordinate, refuse to accept the polite no that had closed so many doors before. He still had not done anything impossible in the way the world writes impossible into headlines. He had, however, done the thing that mattered. He had refused, bureaucratically and practically, to let the story end at denial. He had used his influence to gather committees, not to buy outcomes, but to anchor a process that might yield them. He had kept his lines clear. He had insisted on consent. He had made a plan. There would be other tests, other complications, other nights when Maya would doubt. There would be moments when the tender tightness between two people, one vulnerable, one in a position to aid, would need explicit boundaries and formal documentation. There would also be moments when ethics and affection performed a careful, sometimes awkward dance. For now, in this slender season between operation and outcome, between denial and funding, Maya rose from the therapy mat and reached for a cup. The fingers closed around porcelain and held. The motion was not grand. It was not the arc of a miraculous movie moment. It was, instead, a small, stubborn proof that the body's language had begun to answer the persistent commands of a patient who refused to relinquish agency. Outside, spring moved with an indecent swiftness, flowering on edges that had seemed impossible. Inside, the hospital hummed. The next decisions would be taken in conference rooms and on keyboarded letters and during heated phone calls with funders. The scene was not cinematic, it was procedural, but it was also, Maya felt it, with a quiet, unadorned joy, the thin beginning of what they had set out to do. If this story moves you, consider subscribing for more narratives about perseverance and the quiet, real work that changes lives. They did not yet know whether the next stage would bring standing or stalling. They had, however, carved out a small space where possibility might be tested. The days ahead promised more graphs of time and more frames of repetition. The infection had passed, the insurer had extended a thin bridge, and the philanthropic review had asked for a presentation. The team prepared their materials. The therapists logged another successful hold. And then, in the middle of one late afternoon, when sunlight slanted like a tension across the therapy room, a call came in from the hospital's finance office. There had been a sudden change in the philanthropic committee's leadership, resulting in a pause on all pending disbursements until a new review could be scheduled. The 3-month window of provisional coverage would not be extended without that money. The patient advocate called Daniel first. He put the call on speaker. The sound of the blocked funding landed like a weight. Maya sat on the edge of the mat and could feel the room tilt for a moment, as if reality itself had become negotiable. The therapists' faces closed into professional masks. The social worker's fingers moved on the phone as if in a desperate Morse code. "We'll appeal," Daniel said, voice even. He had stacks of notes, of precedents, but he also had the inconvenient truth that institutional money moved on a calendar that had little respect for human urgency. Maya felt the old, small terror moving at the base of her skull. She thought of the bookstore, of the landlord's patient voice, of the tiny beasts of bills that ate each month. She had already signed the forms that tethered her to this path. She had chosen to try. Now she needed more than will. She needed the world to keep moving in a way that allowed her time. Daniel placed a hand on the edge of the therapist's table, an act of solidarity that did not require words, and said, "We'll find a way. We have to. We'll make the case to the foundation, to the board. We'll bring testimony, data, video of her progress. We'll show them it's not charity, it's return on rehabilitation." The words were logistic and human at once, a clinician's vow braided with an advocate's urgency. Maya listened and felt both gratitude and the hush of dependency. She did not like the feeling, but she accepted it, because choosing to be helped sometimes means trusting someone else to carry the weight for a while. They organized, they prepared, they turned the struggle into a sequence of meetings and evidence. Yet in the private night, with the city breathing and the hospital quiet, Maya felt an ache that had little to do with the body and everything to do with the precariousness of help. She lay awake and tried to make a map of the next months in her head. Therapy goals, funding milestones, small personal aims, like watching the evening sky from the cafe with a friend or holding a book while sitting in the sunlight. The story had not resolved. It would not resolve for a long time. But something important had changed. She had found, against the chorus of refusals, a clinician who would not let the door close without fighting for a better answer. He had rallied a team, he had documented consent, and he had pressed a system to do something it rarely wanted to do. In the slog of recovery, in the mundane increments of therapy logs and appeal letters, there was now a shape of hope. When dawn slipped under the curtains the next morning, she lifted her hand to the window and felt the warmth of light on her palm. It was an ordinary thing, but after months of small battles and quiet victories, it felt enormous. She closed her fingers around the sill with a careful pressure, testing the tendon, listening to the faint, familiar hum of the city below. For a moment, she simply sat and let daylight be its witness. The next weeks were carved into a new pattern. The appeal had bought them time. The Foundation's board had scheduled a second review after Daniel and the team sent a short film of her daily work. The morning exercises, the recorded thumb flexion, the therapist's notes. The video was clinical and tender at once, showing a woman who arrived at the mat every day and performed the same acts. Repetition that might look monotonous to an outsider, but to anyone who had watched neural networks rebuild themselves was painstaking architecture. Maya kept a notebook now, not because anyone asked her to, but because she needed to mark the small truths that stitched a life together. The exact number of repetitions that week, how a particular stretch felt like a small opening. She wrote about the sound of a therapist's breath when she hit a goal, half relief, half pride. She wrote about the nights she woke and felt phantom footsteps, and the mornings she woke and could curl a finger long enough to trace a letter. The entries were private, raw, a map of a body learning its routes again. When the Foundation agreed to release the next tranche of funds, it was not grand. It was conditional and tethered to continued progress and a plan for eventual community reintegration. The philanthropic director explained it over a video call with the frankness that matched their lives. Money, like medicine, was finite. They wanted clear, measurable aims, a baseline of function, and a plan to transition to outpatient therapy in a less costly setting. Daniel framed it to the team as the sort of cautious hope he preferred. No headlines, just possibility. Months lengthened, and with them came the peeling back of old fears. There were setbacks, a late fall that bruised a shoulder, a bout of discouragement after a therapist left mid-season for a new job. There were practical annoyances, transportation missteps, a misfiled chart that delayed authorizations, and always the hum of paperwork. But the essence of progress lived in gestures too small for most to notice. The first time she could drag a mug to her lips without spilling. The day she threaded a needle and felt the quiet elation of an ordinary, intimate task. The evening she ate soup without a caregiver beside her. Then, 6 months from surgery, something particular happened. It was on a Tuesday, the kind that had always felt bureaucratic and gray, when a therapist, teaching Maya an assisted standing routine, felt a change in muscle recruitment. They had rehearsed the sequence thousands of times. Braces locked, therapist hands on hips, a slow transfer to a standing frame. Today, as the device supported her weight and the physiotherapist counted deliberately, 1, 2, 3, Maya pressed with the soles of her feet in a tiny, deliberate way. It was not a full weight shift, not a stride. It was a voluntary contraction in her left hip flexor that had not responded to command before. The physiotherapist's hand tightened on her belt with the sort of professional catch that reads like awe. Maya felt a ringing, electric certainty. This was created by months of disciplined work, not by luck. They filmed it for documentation, of course. The footage would be one line in a dossier that kept her on the program. But in the small room, the sound was simply the counting of breaths and the rustle of fabric. Daniel watched the clip later in his office with the team. And there was the practical language they used. Percent recruitment, expected timeline for functional gains, the potential for aided ambulation with orthotic support. But there was also, briefly, a quiet between them, where no one spoke clinicalese. It was a moment of shared recognition that systems could sometimes be moved by stubborn people who would not accept the closest door as final. The breakthrough did not instantly rewrite their lives. It rewrote a plan. The team proposed, with cautious optimism, a phased ambulatory program. increased weight-bearing sessions, custom orthoses, balance training, and a gradual plan for community reintegration exercises that would begin with short walks within the hospital corridor and progress to the courtyard, then to a ramped route outside. All of it required funding, assembly of a new set of therapists, and a careful ethics check, because more aggressive rehab could bring strain and risk. Maya signed her consent again, precisely and deliberately. She asked, calmly, about the evidence, about risks. She insisted on the presence of the therapist she trusted through the first months. Her agency was the guidepost. The day she first stood with assistants, she wore a shirt that smelt faintly of lemon oil, the residue of her bookstore, and a brace that felt like a necessary apology to gravity. The room had the ordinary elements of hospital choreography: a mat, harness straps, therapists with measured voices. The frame held her in a position neither upright nor entirely dependent. At first, she could only hold for seconds before the burn of it made her breath thin and jagged. They timed the holds, and with each increment she felt the world expand by the fraction of a degree. Then, one afternoon, the count reached 20, and the physiotherapist encouraged a forward step. Her left foot slid and found the floor with a small, trembling courage. Someone in the corner made a sound that might have been a laugh and might have been a sob. Maya tasted iron in her mouth and a kind of relief that made her pulse slow, even as her legs trembled. It was not a movie moment. It was a measured, negotiated advance. A new plan began to take shape around the idea that she could relearn how to move through space, at least in small, safe increments. Outside the therapy rooms, the bookstore reopened on a limited schedule, managed by an assistant whom Maya had trained before surgery. The first time she visited, she used a borrowed wheelchair and a ramp Daniel had helped authorize for the doorway. Standing at the entrance, she felt a complicated joy, tender, wary, luminous. The shop smelled the way memory does: paper, lemon oil, the faint dust of pages turned many times. Customers greeted her with an affection that was careful and steady. She sat at a table near the window and turned pages with one hand, savoring the weight of a book against a palm that had, months before, been unable to do that. The ethical lines that Daniel had drawn remained visible. As her progress shifted from inpatient to outpatient, he convened a formal transition. A new primary physiatrist took over routine care, and Daniel documented the transfer in the chart. He wrote a note explaining his involvement, recorded his reasons for the transfer, and suggested a monitoring schedule. He continued to consult peripherally as a colleague and coordinator, but the direct daily care was now in the hands of someone without the same personal stake. Maya signed the transfer forms with an even hand. The formality of it relieved both of them. The clean break gave room for whatever human feelings might exist to be considered outside the pressing, unequal frame of clinician and patient. Once the transfer was complete and time had made the professional separation clear, they began, cautiously and with candor, to explore what lay outside the clinical relationship. They met initially in neutral places: the hospital cafe for a coffee between rounds, a small gallery show where cameras were turned off, a brief walk in the courtyard where the university's magnolia trees had started to bloom. Their conversations were different now, less chart, more daily. He asked about the new display she had planned for the shop. She asked about the book he had been reading for leisure. There was tenderness in these exchanges, scaled to parity. If romance grew, it did so slowly and with respect for the contours that had been laid down by months of mutual work and careful ethics. They both named the awkwardness of history, the power that had been in his hands, and acknowledged it plainly. They made no attempts to erase what had been. He had been her advocate and clinician through a life-defining season. She had been his patient and partner in long, difficult work. Mutuality emerged in time and in small acts: coffee poured and accepted, a hand offered to steady a step, a laugh shared over a private joke about therapy socks. The impossible, by then, had been reframed in a truer light. It was not a headline cure. It was a patient who, with support and labor and stubbornness, had reclaimed parts of a life that bureaucracy tried to fence off. It was a team that would not let a case become merely a statistic. It was a clinician who marshaled resources without purchasing consent, who documented every decision, who insisted on oversight. For Maya, it was months of pain and discipline that allowed her to pick up a book with both hands and see the world in increments of possibility. In the months that followed, she moved between the shop and therapy, sometimes in a brace, sometimes in a cane stride that required balance and attention. She resumed tasks that had felt like miracles when they were first achieved. Shelving a row of new arrivals, handing a child a picture book, counting the till at the end of the day. Each a small ledger entry in a life rebuilt. Friends returned in waves. Some relationships had altered and hardened, others softened. Her family began the slow work of reconciliation. Not every conversation was easy, but there was attendance now where there had been absence. In time, the shop filled with people who had watched a woman bent to a task and stay with it. Customers would occasionally ask about her recovery, and she would answer honestly. Months, hard work, setbacks. She told them less about the technicalities than about discipline and the way hope